Hello and welcome everyone to the first video lecture. So today we're going to start talking about myths of creation. Creation myths would be another way of putting it. And we're going to look at a bunch of these, and we're even going to do some individual research into creation myths. And you find these stories of the origin of everything. We talked about origins before, but now we're looking at the origins of the universe, the origins of civilization, the origins of all of everything, basically. So if we're trying to provide explanations, maybe what we want most of all is an explanation of how did it all start? What was the very beginning? And very frequently you see some interesting stories about the gods and how things evolved over time. So we're going to be taking a look at that. And since Greek mythology is always a favorite, we're going to start with the ancient Greek creation myth. Although really I should say it's one of a few different options for that. And there's not just one creation myth for the ancient Greeks, but there's a lot of variations on basically the same core ideas. And so we're going to look at those ideas as they were recorded in one particular work. And this is a work called the Theogony, however you want to say it. And it is by a guy named Hesiod. Sometimes I call him Hesiod, but Hesiod's the better pronunciation for that. So let's zoom in a little bit here. And yeah, I just want to start with the point that a lot of these sources we think, this is just what the myth is. Here it is written down, but every myth has to come from somewhere. And usually when a myth is written down, it's one particular version of that myth. And so this myth is a composition. It's a poem, and in a way it's kind of a song too, and was part of that kind of storytelling that comes to us from a specific particular tradition. So let's talk about Hesiod. So Hesiod is a lot like another guy you may have heard of, Homer. And what Hesiod and Homer have in common is that they were basically bards, singers, performers. So they were part of this culture that really believed in memorization and singing stories, singing songs and telling stories through those songs about the gods. So what you're reading in the reading right now is actually the transcribed lyrics of a song. And the ancient Greeks didn't make a very clear distinction between poetry and songs. In fact, a lot of cultures don't. It's a relatively recent idea that those are different things. Both of them have to do with rhythm and flow and stuff like that. And Homer is probably a little better known. Homer is best known for the Odyssey and the Iliad, which I want to try and go in next time. We won't be able to go in super detail, but a little bit into detail on these famous works. But Homer and Hesiod are composing in basically the same style, and Hesiod is maybe a little bit better, a little bit less known. And both of them used to be thought of as there were absolutely these people who came up with these compositions, but nowadays modern scholars think that they actually are names that we give to a whole tradition of bards. So there was a whole bunch of people who were telling the stories that Homer is known for, and ancient writers came up with this figure, this character almost of Homer. And the same goes for Hesiod. And so Hesiod, there's a chance he was a real person, but probably the name for this long tradition of poetic storytelling gods. And the ones we're going to be looking at today are the Theogony and the Works and Days. The Theogony is sort of the main creation myth, but Works and Days goes into some creation myth type stuff as well. So we're going to look at that too. Okay, so I'm going to go super into detail on the structure of these poems, but they are kind of weird and interesting in that they were often changed and improvised on, almost sort of like freestyling new ideas and new stories. So the way it would work is that the poet or slash singer would have a lot of different phrases and stories memorized. So he would know all these mythological stories, and he would just go on tangents, to work another story into the larger story that he was telling. And he would change the line, but he would change it in a way that fit the rhythm he was working with. And rhythm is sort of a long, short, short pattern. Long, short, short, six, it's called dender. and they would try and work within that same rhythm. So the way they would do this is they would have specific phrases that they could say about the gods. So the goddess of dawn, they would call her rosy-fingered dawn. That's one translation for what they said. But that's like a little description of her that's evocative. She has rosy fingers because the dawn has this reddish color. Gray-eyed Athena is a big one, or sort of pale-eyed Athena. Earth-shaking Poseidon. Poseidon is also known for earthquakes in addition to being the god of the sea. So they would have all these little different descriptors that they could put in, and most importantly, they would all fit the rhythm. And so you got to imagine all these different poets over this long period of time telling these stories. And probably, they would be hired to perform in like a royal court. The king would find this wandering bard who wanted to, perform his stuff, and the king would say, "Okay, we'll pay you, and let's see how you do." And the bard would try and give a good performance so that the king would the king would pay him very well. And the way we figured this out was kind of basing it on the fact that there are still some modern bards in the area north of Greece, the Balkans, who do something kind of similar to that. And we started realizing that the Greek poems were very similar. So we have this written down version that was written down at some particular time, probably around like the 700s or the 600s BC. So we should remember that that's just sort of a version that got written down at one point, and the original version would have been imprinted a lot more and getting a lot mixed up. Everything changing so much. But the Greeks, did know of this work after it had been written down too. So it became sort of a standard text that they would keep coming back to and saying, "Yeah, you want to learn about the gods? Let's go look in this poem, the Theogony." And that's pretty interesting. It had a very special role in the culture, so it's always good to think about the role in the culture, the function in the culture, and it would continue to be performed. But importantly, and this is a bit different from, say, like the Bible, there wasn't just one canonical version of it. There wasn't a canon, a standard version that was supposed to be the only version of the story. Hesiod was just one version of the story, and there might even have been slightly different versions of Hesiod that were written down differently. So there's a lot of this variation, and in a lot of these ancient polytheistic, meaning having many gods, cultures, it didn't matter necessarily trying to find the one true version. People thought that, there were lots of stories about the gods, and some of them were true and some of them were not true, but it was kind of up to the individual to decide what that was. Okay, so that's basically the background to the poem here. And let's get into, or the two poems, I should say. Let's get into these poems and talk about what's going on in this story and what conclusions we can draw about creation myths from it. So the story basically goes something like this. We start off with chaos, which in ancient Greece doesn't necessarily mean chaos in our modern sense. It means more like a gap, a void. So the void is the first god, this god Chaos, and he exists before anybody else, and then other gods come forth from him, are born asexually. He doesn't reproduce with somebody else, he just kind of spawns them. And that's kind of interesting that he is just reproducing asexually, and it's kind of interesting that it all starts off with this void. That's kind of similar to the way we think about it, in a way that, originally there was the darkness of space, and then stuff started to congeal out of the void, out of outer space. And it's kind of like that. And so you can see that there's kind of an understanding of the science of the universe even before we get into, the modern scientific details. The cosmology, the sort of understanding of the universe, is fairly well fleshed out in certain ways. But we have more to talk about here, including this very interesting scene here, so we'll get to that. But we start off with Chaos, and then Chaos is one of the very first gods, but in pretty short order after that we have Earth, which is pretty similar to our modern scientific consensus of Earth coming out of the void. And then we have gods of sort of darkness and night, like Erebus, the god of darkness, and Nyx, the god of night. So these are the kind of gods you have, but you also have Earth. And now that Earth has come along, things are going to be pretty different. Okay, and actually, let's see. Maybe pull up a word. We can keep track of this type of stuff because we don't really have a whiteboard to work with here. But we'll get back to this scene. So we have Earth. Earth again reproduces asexually, and pretty soon after that we have Sky. So let's start off with Earth and Sky. Sky is also known as Uranos, which is where we get the name of the planet Uranus. That's the Latin name there. And it just is the ancient Greek word for sky. And Earth in Greek is also known as Gaia, or Gay. And those are, again, just the ancient Greek words. So this is pretty straightforward. We're just taking natural concepts and extrapolating out from them. Okay, so then we have Earth and Sky. And Earth and Sky are basically the first generation where we have a couple. Although Sky is technically the son of Earth, but this is the gods. The gods can do whatever they like. And it's just kind of the way these stories work, is that they want to explain there were only a few people at the beginning, but then they run to the problem of everybody being related to each other. Seems like just a natural consequence of that. But they just decide, okay, it's fine for the gods, whatever. So we basically have this series of primordial couples. And so the first couple is Earth and Sky. They're the first set of parents, and they have a lot of children. And among these children, we have Rhea, we have Kronos, also spelled with a C sometimes. And Rhea and Kronos form the next generation here. And we also have a bunch of other interesting people like Prometheus, and various titans. I'll explain what titans are in a second here. Leaving out an E. But yeah, so we have these two generations here. And if you think back on the reading, maybe the weirdest thing that you came across is the relationship between Kronos and his father Uranos, or Uranus, or Sky. So Kronos, we don't really know what his name means, and that's kind of a difference here too with this generation. Kronos fights his father Sky. And why does he do that? Because his mother, the Earth, tells him to. Basically, the story is that Earth can't give birth to the next generation. All of her children, they're, gods, so they're fully grown already, but they're just kind of stuck inside her because Sky is lying on top of her and not getting off. She wants him to go away so she can give birth to her children. And so she realizes that this isn't working, so she hatches a plan. She teams up with Kronos, who is kind of the leader of the gods for this generation, just as Sky is the leader for the previous generation. And Earth, Gaia, gives Kronos a sickle made of adamant. And adamant is just sort of a legendary name for a metal that is so strong nothing can destroy it. It's indestructible. And Kronos uses that to attack his father, and in fact, as we see in the PowerPoint here, cut off his genitals. So here's Greek mythology being extremely weird, as you can. The question in our minds is, why is that? And I think that's what we're going to pick up in the next video. Why do the Greeks have a story about someone cutting off his father's private parts? That is a very good question, and we'll talk about that in the next one.